So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maria Kokori, Research Fellow at the Art Institute, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to Pip Lawrenson's lecture. The lecture is part of the Modern Contemporary Materialities lecture and workshop series at the Art Institute. From May 2017 to the spring of 2018, the Art Institute will host 4 lectures paired with scholar workshop discussions on specific topics that impact our understanding on modern and contemporary materialities today. The series will culminate in an object-based art history scholars' day in spring 2018 that will draw together the various threads of discussion advanced over the course of the year. The event considers some of the broad issues and ideas associated with the concept of materiality and, of course, immateriality, and it aims to provide the opportunity to engage much broader section of the visual profession into dialogue, most crucially artists, art historians, curators, conservators, and scientists. Materiality points to the whirling complexity and entanglement of diverse factors, especially in the digital age, in which material, like sound or language, can also be something that is not physical, and it is an effect of an ongoing, I will call it, performance. And especially new meanings multiply further where different global contexts are considered. A work of art to be material is a question of a complex trajectories. If one wants to be complicit with materials, it's not enough simple to point to the fact that some objects are made out of paint, oil, pigments, wood, or stone, and how we react to them. The point is to understand the history of the materials used, to research other contexts in which they were applied, to follow their traces. Focusing on the moments where materials live behind the confines of the academic art, become willful actors and agents within artistic processes, and react with their audience in a network or connections, this series of lectures aim to map and explore the substances that artists have engaged with, to expand notions of process, time, space, form, structure, contingence, or participation. The cross-disciplinary dialogue will address questions such as, can materiality foster a new method for thinking about art, and what is in its place in the art history studies? What does it mean to give agency to the material, to follow the material, and to act with the material? What is a medium? And what constitutes the materiality of a medium? Its technological apparatus, the epistemic conditions of its gradual emergence and evolution, or its appropriation and use in various cultural practices. How can we write the histories of media without privileging cultural semantics over the technical materialities of media? How do disciplinary epistemology shape or impede our understanding of media? To what extent do media write and conceive of their own history and evolution? And is media art an experimentation with unknown possibilities and unpredictable future? And I have more and more questions, especially after a long discussion with Pip. I have even more questions that increase rather than reduce the complexity of this topic, but I hope this series is going to stimulate plenty of thought-provoking discussion. This is not the first time, and this is not the first event to deal with materiality in modern and contemporary art, nor, of course, is likely to be the last one. And it's also not the first time that scientists and conservators have met with curators and art historians to discuss some of these topics. But I hope that the format of these events, consisting of very focused discussions, will foster the kind of dialogue that will move the curatorial, conservation, and art historian fields forward. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Pip. Pip Lawrenson is the head of collection care research at the Tate and professor of art collection and care at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. She has over 20 years of experience in the conservation of contemporary art, beginning her career in sculpture conservation at Tate and going on to establish and lead Tate's pioneer time-based media conservation section from 1996 until 2010. Pip is committed to interdisciplinary research that serves and responds to art of our time and in exploring what it means for a contemporary art museum to be a research organization. She has acted as the lead for Tate on a number of collaborative research initiatives, including inside installations, collecting the performative, matters in media art, and new approaches to the conservation of contemporary art. In her current role, she develops, leads, and supports research related to the conservation and management of Tate's collection. She receives her PhD from the UCL, University College of London, She's an accredited member of the Institute of Conservation, a trustee of the UK's National Science and Heritage Forum, and a member of the steering committee of INCA, the International Network for the Conservation of Contemporary Art. I would like to especially thank the Stockman Family Foundation for generally supporting the Modern Contemporary Materialities lecture and workshop series, the co-organizers of the events, Francesca Casadio and Jill Bukalski, Ann Goldstein, Sarah Guernsey, Fran Giucari, and the Audrey W. Mellon Foundation. Thanks are also due to many colleagues who provided support and encouragement, Jan Trujillo for her support in the organization of the event, and all our colleagues for audio and video support. So again, my thanks to PEEP and to all of you for attending what we hope to be an important and enjoyable event. And without further delay, I would like to welcome PEEP upon the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation today. It's a great opportunity, actually, to be at the Chicago Art Institute. And I'd very much like to thank Maria and the Institute for their invitation, and also Jan and her team for all the great organisation that it takes to put something like this together. So in preparing this talk, I've tried to shift my thinking on around two key interests of mine, which I hope will be of interest to you too, about the networks which underpin the making and conservation of works of contemporary art that sit outside the museum, and our connections within the museum to this wider public world. My paper is therefore framed around the following key questions. Can conservation make different connections to our public by making visible the networks of people, skills, and materials that underpin the making of contemporary artworks? And secondly, through focusing on their materiality, can the objects in our collections puncture holes in the skin of the museum? Can a focus on materiality make our institutions inherently more connected and porous? So this, for conservation, means redrawing the boundaries of the ethics of our practice through our connection to the objects in our care and a set of broader cultural considerations. I'm going to discuss these questions in relation to two artworks in Tate's collection. The first is Tariq Atui's The Reverse Collection from 2013 to 2016, and the other is Catherine Yass's Corridors, made in 1994. In what follows, I hope to weave together some recent thinking on the nature of conservation and artworks with some new thinking on how a focus on making might impact our practice, and how a focus on the networks underpinning production might help to connect the museum to the world outside and make us more porous. This exploration is iterative, and thank you for giving me a chance to air some of these thoughts today. So materiality is a really odd concept for conservators. We're trained to focus on the material. Our practice is full of unruly materials that ooze and crack and drop and rot and rust and flake and frankly fall apart. Our role could be interpreted as keeping up appearances of the timeless and stable nature of art objects. Conservation traditionally mixes the conservation of the scientific understanding of the materiality of a work and the meaning of the work, where the meaning is expressed in terms of the intent of the artist, or at least what they were trying to communicate or express in a work, or in art historical or critical terms, or in social and cultural terms. Increasingly, conservation will consider multiple forms of meaning and value that are seen as constructed over time and place and weighted differently for different types of collection. Conservation pivots around two questions. What is this artwork, and what am I trying to preserve about it? And because it is a practice, conservation then asks, how best might we try and do that? Conservation has struggled to raise its gaze from these fascinating materials. When Robert Morris famously declared, the object has not become less important, it merely has become less self-important, namely, having given up an exaggerated sense of its own value. He signals a need for conservation to broaden its gaze to consider in some circumstances that the material may be contingent. Its significance may differ depending on the way in which meaning has been constructed for the artwork. And here's the shocker. The materiality of an artwork may no longer be synonymous with what is important to conserve. So conservation is an emerging academic discipline. Its development can be usefully compared to other practice-based disciplines. However, as yet, it has not suffered some of the conflicts between practice and theory that have beset areas such as business or management studies. In recent years, important theoretical work for the conservation of contemporary art has been carried out both by research practitioners, and in my little world, the important people have been Monica Marchesi, Sanika Stickler, Hannah Holling, Jill Sterrett, and Glenn Wharton, amongst others. And also there are those from other disciplines, for example, philosophy, Rennie van der Waal, and ethnography, Fernando Dominguez Robibo, and Vivian Van Cez, and then sociology, Jan Maron-Tate. And of course, there are art historians who've also cared about conservation issues, like Tina Fisk, as well as many others. So some of the theories which have gained traction include the notion of autographic and allographic from Nelson Goodman. These were ideas that were very important to me. Stephen Davies and the ideas of work defining properties for the less material things like musical performances. Bruno Latour's actor network theory, Gérard Genet on immanence and plurality, and Jacques Derrida on translation. As you can see, contemporary conservation theory is rather magpie-like in what it draws upon. Through initiatives such as the Marie Curie Innovative Training Network, we're seeing research in the conservation engage as much in recent humanities-based theoretical developments as it traditionally has, looking at scientific developments. So modern and contemporary art may have challenged notions associated with the hand of the artist and skill by using a range of unorthodox materials, have engaged with industrial forms of making and fabrication. However, it has also foregrounded its materials, whether we're talking about the organic felts, and fats of Joseph Beuys's fat battery, or the delicate corten surfaces of Nan Garbo's head number 2, made originally in a smaller version in 1916 and then made into a larger version in 1964. Of course, here we see the removing of all censor about what might constitute an artistic medium. For time-based media artworks, what disrupts the normal focus of conservation is the way in which they resemble an event rather than an object, acting as installed events which bring together assemblages of different elements to perform the work each time it is displayed. This might be equipment of a certain type, specific art objects, display copies of media, constructed spaces with light lock corridors, carpets, acoustic materials, screens, etc. For conservation, what is held by the museum is the means to realize this work, including the material means and also the knowledge of the parameters of what must be realized in order to enact a display of this work, and of course, the authority and rights to do so. Whilst all areas of conservation practice concern what might be called hybrid assemblages, there is something in the realization of time-based media works of art that brings this sharply to the fore. Not only is time-based media conservation focused on the ability to bring together technologies, equipment, and the properties of space and viewing conditions, such as acoustic properties or perhaps light levels in the room, all dogged by the constraints of technological change, obsolescence, architecture, and budget. But they are also often bringing together people, skills, and technologies, a technological infrastructure to produce the display material. This dependency is particularly keenly felt when displaying media that is moving from the obsolete to the rare, such as 35mm slides, 16mm film, or audio tape cassettes, or where the complex dependencies of a live environment require almost constant maintenance, as in software-based art. So time-based media artworks are therefore precarious in both their dependency on an uncertain technological future, the degree to which their realization is dependent on a complex array of people and things, and also, when on display, the risk of imminent technical failure, which might leave just nothing but an empty black box or a blank screen. So time-based media installations and performances in their identity as installed events demand that we take an approach that sees each installed instantiation of the work as an event, as a production, involving many people, things, skills, processes, and materials. In some cases, famously, for example, in the works of Tino Chagall, these works might be materialized during their display through interpreters. This is Chagall's name for his performers. They leave no material remains in the terms of documents, photographs, videos, or recordings. So the questions that shape this presentation are grounded in practice. They are also informed by a belief that art is the result of human and non-human agents, and the making of art is a relational activity, bringing together the social world and materiality, and driven by desire. The dimensions of interest are time, geography, ecologies of people, skills, technologies, materials, and ontologies which unfold. Artworks create trajectories over time and networks which involve relationships between places. Artworks operate within particular ecologies, and I'm particularly interested in the ecologies of making. Artworks exhibit unfolding and at times parallel identities, for example, through additions. So in his paper on the discrepancy between objects and things, an ecological approach, Fernando Dominguez Rubio makes a distinction between objects and things. Things which are imbued with value, meaning, and power become objects. In Western culture, one of the examples of these types of object are the art objects, which are seen as, and I quote, unique and irreplaceable products of human creativity. Excuse me. However, Rubio argues that not only can the relationship, this perfect match of identities between the thing and the object, between the thing and its status as an object be severed, it is also precarious. And I'm going to add two other quotes from Rubio because I think this concept's actually really useful for conservation. So, this match between things and objects is fragile and breaks down over time. The reason for this is that things, qua material process, are always changing, and as they do, they undo objects as well as the social relations and meaning that are threaded through them. He goes on to say, although the museum cannot halt the movement of things, it can at least aspire to slow it down, to sustain, for as long as possible, the illusion of a timeless art object. For that is, after all, what an object is, an identity that has to be negotiated and maintained through change until the discrepancy between objects and things makes that identity no longer possible. I think this is a really useful way of thinking about conservation, and I like this recasting of conservation as concerned with keeping the identity of the thing and the object aligned. And certainly it sits well with collections that are not static things, but unfolding, partial, and becoming. Maybe, in fact, that's all our collections. In the 1990s, many of the works which I dealt with as a time-based media conservator were aspirationally, ontologically stable. So here I'm thinking about works by artists such as Bill Viola, Stan Douglas, this is one of Stan Douglas's works, Steve McQueen and James Coleman. And I picked this image actually because it does show this sort of rather beautiful space that's being created. They wanted to be more stable than the technological environment and their ontological status as allographic rather than autographic works allowed for. Stability was experienced by some artists as unfulfilled expectation, as technological change impacted their work in unexpected and often undesirable ways. Undesirable not least because these very precisely specified works, change was really not desired. However, more recently, increasingly I've had the privilege of working with artworks which defy ideas of completeness and continue to want to unfold within the museum. Works which offer conservation a very different proposition from the works that I spent my time with in the 90s. Works which arise from a different frame and ask for different approaches. These are works which have a more adaptive DNA, including within them instructions for growth and development. Here, the shift of focus to notions of practice provides a fruitful perspective to characterize the different roles which are part of this ongoing engagement. There are different ways in which works of art might unfold. They might unfold as we seek to know them better, within the variety of different knowledge-producing cultures we approach a work from, whether art history, conservation, curatorial, or artistic practice. They might unfold over time whilst on display, as with time-based media and performance works, or for some contemporary artworks, they might unfold as the objects of artistic practice through the ongoing engagement of the artist. In her paper, Objectual Practice, this is from 2001, Karen Norsetina, who actually focuses on high-end scientific environments, so she looks at high-end biology and physics. So the focus in this paper is on knowledge-centered professional practice, which she characterizes as both creative and constructive. It's the type of practice that is present when we confront non-routine problems. And she sees this practice as relational rather than performative, meaning that it's focused on the relationship to a differentiated epistemic object, so the focus of our knowledge production, rather than habitual tasks. What she foregrounds is our relationship to the things we're engaged with as epistemic objects during our knowledge-producing activities. So, responding to the diversity of artistic practice and the changing nature of art, I'd like to argue that if we characterize the objects of contemporary art conservation depending on our practices, culture, and questions, which we're being asked both by the artist and conservator, the art historian, and the curator. So this idea is that we've got the artwork as the sort of focus of all this activity, and actually that artwork is for us a different sort of epistemic object. And the sorts of questions we bring to it and the sorts of responsibility and authority we have over it are really dependent on our practice. So the questions that a conservator in a museum will ask with a very much a view to the long term are going to be very different from the questions that the artist is going to produce in terms of seeing that as the object of the unfolding object of their art practice. So I think the reason I keep banging on about this, the reason I think this is important is that I think it helps us to demarcate the territory and the authority of the different practices in relation to the artwork, so that we can distinguish the role of the conservator or the artist or the curator or the artist's assistant. Of course, there's still potential to explore how these roles might be delegated, but I think that this focus on practice helps to clarify and demarcate the authority and responsibility as determined through these specific practices. So what drew me to the work of Karen Norsetina and her account of these epistemic objects is the degree to which it aligns also to our experience of those artworks which failed to fit our assumptions of the complete artwork for which a set of work-defining properties can be described. So I'd like to explore the possibility that these artworks are also in themselves epistemic objects of artistic practice, as well as the epistemic objects of our conservation practice. Although actually this idea of the artwork being determined by the questions that we bring from our practice actually works perfectly well for our traditional artworks as well. And I think if we look at some of the extraordinary work that conservators and conservation scientists do in relation to really digging deep and trying to solve particular problems about artworks, there's no doubt that this is a knowledge-producing practice. But I also want to use this notion to help us understand how these artworks themselves unfold in a much more kind of contemporary and some of these more contemporary and challenging works. So I'm going to do this to start with by looking at Tariq Atui's The Reverse Collection, and then I'm going to talk about Catherine Yass's Corridors, because they are both epistemic objects of my conservation practice, and my understanding of both has unfolded over long periods of time, or different actual periods of time. For Atui, I think it's really been a question of a couple of years that I've understood the Reverse Collection, whereas I've spent 20 years working with Catherine Yass about corridors. And so I think it kind of gives these different temporal dimensions to these notions. I'd also like to suggest that the relationship of some artists to their artworks as epistemic objects help us to illuminate the ways in which certain artworks in our collections just fail to conform. So let's start with the Reverse Collection. So this was born out of Tariq Atui's interest in Arabic music and ancient musical instruments that were where much of the expertise about how to play these instruments has been lost. And in an interview with Tariq Atui, he really talks about his interest in Arabic music being its ability to adapt, and that being this notion at its core. It's a form that defied notation, and partly because it didn't want to be fixed in a particular aesthetic moment. It wanted to leave open the possibility of future instrumentation. So engaging with different musicians and composers, this story actually begins in Dahlem, in Berlin in 2014. Dahlem is an extraordinary collection of ethnographic musical instruments. And what Atui did is he brought together a range of musicians to explore the sounds that could be created through these musical instruments. And a period of research resulted in a series of performances where a range of instruments were performed. I think what's really fascinating about this, for people who sit in the museum, is this project really started from a conversation between Tariq Atui, the conservators at the museum, and the director of the museum, and the purpose of the musical instruments collection, and why the instruments were often rendered unplayable in order to ensure their preservation. And I quote from an interview that I conducted with the artist. And he said, the museum director's answer was that this conservation happens for ethnomusicologists to be able to reproduce the instrument by studying its mechanisms, materials, and principles to make a replica. And from this discussion, Atui recounts that he thought, okay, well, let's take a component that is discarded, which is the sound of the instrument, and try and make a new history from that point on. So in the context of the 8th Berlin Biennial in 2014, Atui invited 18 contemporary musicians to explore the collection at Dahlem. And he created a number of soul recordings. There were a number of constraints that they worked in regarding which instruments and whether they could tighten strings or how they had to wear mouth guards for some of the wind instruments because of the chemicals that had been treated. But, so there's this quite extraordinary amount of effort went in to create these performances from which a recording was made. And then from the recording from these sets of performances, Atui basically created a mix, and he sent this mix to different instrument makers. And in response to this recording, they created 7 new musical instruments. So he separated out for woodwind, strings, and percussion, and then sent these recordings off. So we have the new instruments at this point. It's quite a complex tale. And then he invited composers. He wasn't done at this point. He invited composers, musicians, and instrument makers to then perform with this new set of musical instruments, first in a series of performances known as the Reverse Sessions in Mexico City in 2014, and then later with 25 musicians, which then came to influence the work that happened at Tate. So I'm just going to, this is the installation in Curizmanzuto Gallery in Mexico City. And then this is an image from the performances at Tate. And what I'm going to do is we're just going to play a little bit of this recording. So, hold on.
The more my work develops, the more performance is an articulation within something wider.
I might just start that again, actually, just because
The reverse collection, the idea is to have...
Okay, let's try again.
The more my work develops, the more performance is an articulation within something wider. With the reverse collection, the idea is to have all these performances inside the tanks and at the same time to record them. Whatever is being played here will become my material to work on a composition that we can hear inside the space. Performing is to help a research or to help understand something that would allow making an instrument or making an interface or pushing a concept further. And that's how I start to understand and work with performance as a strong, concentrated momentum that can teach you a lot about other things you're looking for. The idea of audience becomes...
Okay. That is on Vimeo, so feel free to watch the whole wonderful thing now. Now, this work has come into the collection, and with the conservation and curatorial team, obviously we're working across a number of issues. One is that these instruments will be replayed, so there are concerns about how we might manage the remaking of those in the future, because they're very fragile, some of them. But Tarek Atou's has been extraordinary in that not only has he done quite kind of beautiful, I don't know if you can see this, but beautiful diagrams illustrating the instruments. He's also done individual videos which help people to understand what it means to maintain and play these instruments. And actually, the reverse collection demonstrates similarities with our film, slide, software-based and time-based media works and many of our performances, in that this work requires that we remain connected to specific communities of practice external to the natural relationships maintained by the museum, namely contemporary electroacoustic musicians and musical instrument makers. Connecting to these communities are required for Tate to be able to activate these works in the future. And what Tarek Atou's says is getting the music and art worlds to meet outside of their usual frameworks allows new ideas to emerge on both sides and reconnects the work with the legacy of my favorite composers and artists. So not only do we have in this artwork this idea of this unfolding nature into the future with these complex relationships in terms of how this work can be realized. It can either be realized as an installation, it can be realized inviting composers and musicians to come and play the instruments in new performances, according to a slightly improvised but within a structure score that Terra Katui has established, or it could mean reactivating from the original recordings and making new instruments. So it's got quite a complex ontology, this work. But he's also, not only has he made us think about that, he's also demanded that we have this relationship with the world outside the museum, and that we actually, in order to have this work in the collection, we need to really think about how we maintain that relationship. And that's something that's really interesting to me, because I think it actually highlights something that we know within the museum anyway, that we have these dependencies externally. So the artwork is a small socio-material network that has involved 11 instrument makers, 7 instruments, 59 musicians, 1 musical coordinator, the artist, the Dahlem Museum and its collection, the museums and galleries involved, their staff and their spaces in the displays, the Berlin Biennial as the instigator, the compressors, compressed air, audiences or lack of them, chance, improvisation, composition and intent. It has emerged over a period of 3 or 4 years and conceived of as having a DNA authored by a TUI that is set to unfold over time. Such a work asks us to reassess the relationship to the public sphere and the museum. So I'm interested in this threshold, and so thinking about going back to some of these ideas that we know about the history of the museum, I think it's useful to return to the 1955 essay, The Valéry Proust Museum, where Adorno famously presented a dilemma between 2 conflicting propositions: the necessity for objects to be locked in the museum for more democratic access instead of private houses and for preservation, and the fact that in his mind this resulted in the removal of these artworks from their context, putting them at risk of irrelevance. And I quote the most famous passage. The German word museal, or museum-like, has an unpleasant overtones. It describes objects to which the observer no longer has a vital relationship and which are in the process of dying. They owe their preservation to more to historical respect than to the needs of the present. Museum and mausoleum are connected by more than phonetic association. Museums are like the family sepulchres of works of art. They testify to the neutralization of culture. Art treasures are hoarded in them, and their market value leaves no room for the pleasure of looking at them. And I think there's something here of this critique in Terra Katui's relationship to the musical instruments within the Dahlem Museum. But as Didier Meleuve has written in Museum Memories, the museumification of art has been taken as a symptom that art in the modern period is no longer integrated into living praxis, but an object fit only for historians, connoisseurs, curators, and cultural officials. There is a notion of authenticity at work here, where art in the museum is considered inauthentic, in that it is removed from contemporary culture and real life. There is the idea that art has an original context that exists outside the museum. This preoccupation with breaking down the division between art and life is something that we see in a number of strands of contemporary practice. And we can think of a couple of these, but actually I think one that's quite useful to refer to, and I could zoom back because I put it in the wrong place, but this Tanya Bruguera's work, Tatlin's Whispers, number 5. Maybe I will have a quick zoom back. Shall I quickly zoom back? There we are, this one. So this work is only able to be realized should the relationship between certain political and cultural structures remain, so namely the use of horses and control of crowds and the proximity to civil unrest, etc. So this concern for the threshold between the museum and the world outside is echoed in the questions we posed as one of the frames of this paper. Namely, can a focus on the networks underpinning the production and conservation of art provide ways of creating connections with the world beyond the museum? Is this a way of creating a more porous threshold? A driver for this is, however, not a sense of authenticity as expressed by Adorno, but rather a question of social justice and a desire to democratize access to our collections. I would like to hazard a suggestion that by making visible the making and maintenance of our collections, we make visible the labor and also the desire to create something which sustains these extraordinary projects. I think these are things that have resonance for us at Tate, not only related to questions about our audiences or constituents, but also how we communicate that very museum-y part of Tate, namely activities related to conservation. However, it's not only in works such as the reverse collection, with its different trajectories and forms, and its complex history and relationship over time written into its DNA, that can do this. Whilst the reverse collection explicitly intended to connect the museum and a contemporary musical community, our second example, Catherine Yass's photographic series, Corridors, does so simply through its making and its materiality. So it zips through to find Corridors. There it is. Keep an eye on time. So recently I've had the real privilege of working with the anthropologist Heidi Geismer. And this, one of the great things about these collaborations actually is that it's a possibility to really open up other people's literature and really share these kind of journeys of examination. So we started to look at Catherine Yass's series, Corridors, from 1994. And for me, this was a return to an object that I was responsible for, developing a conservation plan back in 1996. And what's really surprised me in looking at this again and really going into the making of this object was its singularity. It was so made at a particular moment as a result of certain set of desires and constraints, and also the precarity of the networks of people and skills and technologies that underpinned the making. So I'm going to kind of zoom through this a little bit, but Catherine was commissioned by the Public Art Development Trust in the UK to make a series of images for a psychiatric hospital in southwest London that was built in the 19th century. And she was really interested in the use of photography and research into mental illness. So she took this series of photographs, which were originally supposed to be the backdrops for portraits of people that currently worked or were being treated in the hospital. However, instead, Catherine became really interested in these images of empty spaces and decided to create these works as the finished pieces. So I won't go into it, actually, but because we're running out of time, but one of the things that we've really been looking at using anthropological techniques like chaîne-à-poiretoire is really to understand the very precise way in which these works are constructed, because looking at them, even for very experienced photographic conservators and curators, it's actually very hard to unpick them. They've got all sorts of elaborate moments of cross-processing in them and some really extraordinary, I'll sum it up. I mean, basically, she had two images, one of which was loaded the wrong way round and then processed as E6, and the other, right way round and processed as E6, and then wrong way round and processed as C41 processing. And then she created this sandwich, which you can see here, which she spent hours aligning in her studio and doing everything she could to remove the dust. And then from that, she worked with a group called CPL in Edenbridge in the UK and enlarged them onto Cibachrome, and then they are mounted into light boxes. So we have a lot of detail now about this infrastructure that's proved very precarious in terms of the Velvia film that she used, which very particularly had the dynamic range around colour that she wanted, as well as the dates of the Cibachrome material that was only produced between 1992 and 2012. But when Corridors was acquired, the acquisitions process actually initiated this series of conversations that were really partly informed by the fact that these were managed within time-based media conservation. And I think what's interesting is that means that we've had about 20 years of talking about the future of these works and whether they could be replicated. And it's only coming back, I think, at this point that we've really understood just how precarious the networks were that underpinned these works. And also, I think, revisiting these works in the store and having a look at how, despite these hours of painstaking work to remove the dust, we still see these elements that are captured in there. The eyelash in the title of my talk, and these moments of dust. We've also managed to talk to some of the people who were involved, and people who were very quickly made redundant, whose skills were also seen to be quite rapidly made redundant. So we're uncovering this story which really links us to a whole infrastructure and network of skills through this particular artwork, which actually speaks to all sorts of concerns, not only for the local, but also actually the global, as the email I got about the discontinuation of Cibachrome from Kodak referenced the rising cost of silver. So I think these works really offer, through their making and their materialities, stories that actually do connect the world in a very immediate way to the objects in our collection. So I'm conscious of time, so maybe I won't do that. Okay. So in conclusion, I'd like to return to this question of how rendering visible the labour in making materials and technology underpinning these two very different works and its precarity might serve to offer new narratives that might connect the museum to its constituents. At the beginning of this paper, we posed those two questions. And as a practitioner, my inclination at this point is to reframe the practice of conservation as one linking to a broader movement of maintainers, which has been done by the ethnographer Fernando Dominguez Rubio, as well as others like Caravan Molson of AV Preserve and Stephen Jackson of Cornell University. But I'm going to talk about the Dominguez Rubio paper because he has this very immediate sense that leaving traces of their work and their agency can break the spell that makes us see these things as unique and original objects and reveals them as collective objects. Now, one of the questions is that going to cause a problem for the museum and the status of the artist? Actually, I think one of the ways in which we can manage this is by tapping into this notion of desire. And recently, I came across a paper which was actually talking about the global assemblage of assisted reproduction, so quite a different area, but a very emotive topic. And the paper, which is, it's assemblage thinking, the an actor network theory, actually it's on the screen here, gives us a possibility in which we can think about the notion of desire and the artist so that we see this as a positive and productive force that's able to form these connections and enhance the sort of power of the bodies through these connections without really removing the idea of the artist as a bit of a prime mover. So what I like about the agency of the concept is that although the assemblages which emerge prompted by desire, may be supported by many different types of desire, actually it might also assign the artist the primary force here. So working with art and artists, it is the singularity of the vision involved in the production of these works, as diverse as Catherine Yass's corridors and Tarek Atoui's The Reverse Collection, and their ability to mobilize those involved in the making of their work, which is consistent. No doubt there are other desires at play, the desire for skill to be recognized, the desire to perform in certain venues, the desire to be part of something, the desire to get paid, no doubt, all play part for those involved. But it's this desire to create an artwork that is a particular, unique, and irreplaceable product of human creativity, which I think is central. So just as we're in Chicago, I'd like to also, in the spirit of learning from art and artists, point to a work of Theaster Gates, namely To Speculate Darkly, Theaster Gates and Dave the Potter. So this, as I'm sure this audience knows, was an exhibition at the Milwaukee Art Museum in Wisconsin in 2010. And here the ceramics and poetry of an African-American slave potter called Dave was a vehicle for connecting the museum to communities, including those who worked at the Kohler pottery. And here is an example of where, by focusing on the materiality and the making of collections, the artist was able to make the institution more porous and connected. I think we should have the courage to see if we can harness the agency and histories of making and materials to speak to communities about labour and precarity, and to honour some of the long-standing relationships of care and trust that are present in conservation, curatorial and artistic practice, and in their relationships to the networks that underpin their production, display and conservation for a range of types of work. Thank you.
There is time for questions. Do you have any questions?
Did that make sense to anybody? I mean, I guess what I was really interested in doing, I mean, I've worked with all these networks of people who produce films for us, who produce the slides. They're kind of these invisible people we absolutely depend on. And some of them also, you know, artists depend on extraordinarily. And I think these histories are actually very invisible. And it's only when you look back and you realize how much we know about these people within the museum and what these tales, when you phone them up and you find out, oh yes, this extraordinary printer has now become a postman, you know, you realize these stories about the precariousness of these technologies actually have real resonance, I think, to the worlds that we're all living in. And I can't help thinking that actually our public, people we call our constituents, because we're about to have an election, but, you know, I like constituents because they've got a stake in this, would be engaged with. And that's something that actually, with our deep return, you know, we always go back to the object. And in professions like conservation, the object is our starting point. But actually, we can see how these stories could make real connections outside the museum. Is anybody else having discussions like this in their museum? Somebody at the back now? Different question.
Yeah, so this is, I'm an educator here. I'm in charge of learning and public engagement. And I love your paper in terms of the questions that it raises, for instance, in terms of how we communicate with our public about what is the work of art, especially with works like these that you've presented, but especially, you know, the performative works that when they get presented in the context of the museum, oftentimes they feel very fragmentary, they can appear very obscure, they can appear very kind of esoteric, and yet it's partly because maybe we're only presenting one side of it, we're not presenting them, as you described, as a kind of network of material and social relationships. And so how might this change, in fact, how we can be talking about works of art with our public is
Yeah.
just wonderful. Thank you.
I mean, I've been playing with kind of creating maps of these things,
Yeah.
you know, and I think, and it's fantastic once you see the connections. And also, I think the other thing that's quite helpful for the public is, you know, one of the things that Tara Katui talked about was really how difficult it was not being in a kind of performative, normal performative environment where everybody comes, sits, they all come from their community probably pretty much. They pay attention, you know, they're really rapt, you have that kind of engagement. Whereas when he was displaying, you know, and performing his work in the tanks, you know, people drift in and drift out. So they actually developed a whole different way. He talks about playing inward, of playing, because he could no longer rely on that audience. So it's also just to see the impact that coming into this context will have on their work as well that I think is interesting. Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
So I take your point very well throughout the paper about the usefulness of this, and especially the mention of the precarity of those artisans and workers and the industries that undermine this. But I wonder about this, and this may be a bigger conversation, as a general museological strategy, because one of the effects of so extensively focusing on the networks technologies and material histories of objects is to further participate in the fetishization of skill and ends up producing very capital necessary works. So Tara Katui, for instance, that's the amount of capital that was required to hire the team of performers, the team of fabricators, all of this. I mean, if this becomes the way that we think of as a way to engage audiences, then one of the impacts of that may be to further privilege a kind of artwork that's only available to those who can mobilize that kind of capital in order to create an artwork. I know that's not your point, I'm just kind of thinking.
No, but I mean, you know, I like this discussion because actually often what we're talking about is constraints as well. So it's not just the high-end productions. What this sometimes also reveals, I mean, I had to skip a lot of what I was going to talk about with the Catherine Yass because I realized I'd said way too much. But, you know, there's these moments where she had one day and she could only afford to make 2 prints of each. And there was a point at which you've definitely got this sort of dynamic between her and the people in the commercial environment where, you know, they really appreciated her wanting to use their extraordinary skill, which was largely invisible, but there was a point at which the economics had to kick in and they said enough, and that was when the work was made. So I also think that this is a story about some of the constraints economically on making art. So I don't know, let's see whether the same thing can work for things that aren't these extraordinarily elaborate productions involving these networks. And also, I'm not sure how seamlessly we can go from, you know, a traditional sort of object and these works which are pushing the threshold or might be participatory practice. I don't know if we can construct a nice continuum there around this story for a particular strand of perhaps a particular narrative we want to tell. I'm not saying it's the only narrative, I'm just saying maybe it's a good narrative that will help us kind of connect the museum to some of our audiences. But yeah, I think, don't know, let's keep unfolding this one. Yeah.
So in the reverse collection piece, is the Dahlem musical instrument collection a formal component of that artwork?
No, it's not. It's the formal component is outside the space where the work is performed or installed, because it does have an installed form as well, where when the performance is not going on. there is a screen which is not that big. It's kind of, but not that small either, but, it's that sort of size, which shows the original performances of the original musical instruments at Dahlem. So that is a formal component. And it's quite nice, actually, I think, that structure, because it reminds me of Bruce Naumann's mapping the studio to Flip Flop, Fat Chance, John Cage, where outside there's a little kind of area where you see his notebooks, his logs, so it's almost like revealing some of that story and then the artwork. So it's quite nice structure, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was really struck by how polemical your talk became in the center as you were unfolding your argument. And a word popped in there, so I just wanted to put a little pressure on the role of the conservator in this polemic, and to understand what you meant to say when you brought up authenticity. Because I thought I heard you say that more important than authenticity are these questions of the extending outward into the network, the social justice, the democratic access. I think that this is really provocative, and I wonder, is this a call for conservators to reframe the way they think about their practices from looking inward to looking outward a little bit more? Or how would you place the conservator in this kind of expanded or expanding field of engagement?
Well, I think one of the things I was trying to do was, I suppose there's so many different notions of authenticity, and there is one which, is preoccupied conservators about sort of notions of the original or what it is we're trying to preserve. There's also this other one which is often forgotten, which is this Adorno Notion, which is quite different, which is this connection to an outside world. So it was more trying to think about notions of authenticity which might not be the sort of notions that conservators necessarily focus on, which are notions about a connection to an outside world. But even that, I think, in a way, the notion of authenticity is redundant for us there, because I think actually notions of social justice have become more important in terms of the discourse than the way that they were historically framed. So anyway, so I think in terms of the conservator, I think I'm probably thinking more about the museum, but thinking about how we might harness and make visible some of those practices within the museum, which at the moment are completely invisible externally. And I think we've got to move away. This is, my personal kind of view. But, at the moment, we're still very dominated with this mode of display as our primary form of communication. And then we have all this extraordinary stuff that happens. And I think unless we surface that, actually, we're doing a disservice to the extraordinary institutions that we all, are lucky enough to be involved in. But also, I think we're stopping a form of communication which is very relevant to our public. And I think that there's a narrative here about care and commitment in the long term and maintaining things, which I think has got resonance. So, yeah, I probably am a little bit polemical, but only to try it out and for you to shoot it down.
I think it struck me because, Francesca and I went to a Mellon Foundation convening in March, and similar feelings, I think, were surfacing there. So it kind of stood out to me to hear it from you from a completely different point of view.
Okay, good. I may not be alone.
So it strikes me that there are two things at play. On one hand, there's this idea that we're going to present the network and make the image of the network readily available so that we have different means of access and understanding the work. And then there's this idea that we're going to understand the network to such a way that different types of technologies, different types of agents in the process could come to the fore a little bit. And so that's the part that strikes me a little bit, and I wonder, it strikes me potentially as problematic, and I wonder if you come across that in your practice. So for example, we're doing a project where the one you think I'm talking about, but they're one. And the artist created the work for the Paris Biennial, and then it was destroyed. And then he had studio assistants at a later date reconstruct the work for him. And so we're in contact with one of the studio assistants, and this studio assistant is also in contact with all the other institutions that have these works. And so at this stage in time, many have been reconstructed, many according to his hand and according to his knowledge of the work. And so one starts to worry, or I personally have a little bit of anxiety that the narrative now about the work is contingent upon this one studio worker who still lives. And so that maybe we put too much emphasis on one part of the network over the artist's original intentions. So I'm curious if you can...
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of also this idea of the fetishization of skill, which is everybody I speak to about this worries about how this shifts the balance between the artist and the network, whether artists will want to make it visible, whether we're putting too much, we're giving too much power in a way to these other voices. And this is why I really liked this notion of the desires involved. Because actually, if you look at something like Tarek Atoui's, there's nobody's going to doubt that he is like the number one mover and shaker in this thing. And he's tapping into all sorts of other desires, And so I think that might be a useful way to still understand the dynamics of these different relationships. Whether in practice that is a risk, I think you're sort of saying that you're uncomfortable with how it's panning out. And I think we do see that between different studios and issues of control. But I don't know, I wonder if we made the whole thing a bit more transparent, we might move the discussion forward from where it is at the moment, which often just seems to be a slightly kind of behind the scenes arm wrestling for control.
So we do have time for another more question, then the discussion can be continued about your thing. Any other questions? So,
Thank you very much. Thank you.